I am so excited to be here this evening with journalist Dina Kraft, host of the amazing podcast, The Branch, which we will be talking about a lot tonight, as well as Josh Kross, the show's producer. And this is very exciting for me because usually Josh is the one telling me what to do and behind the scenes, and now he is actually on stage and I get to ask him a lot of questions, which is very fun for me personally. I am excited not to talk about myself at all tonight, which is unusual if you listen to Unorthodox. I will just say that tonight I became a member of Hadassah. So yes. I also want to say that I got the memo of the Young Women's Professional Group from New York to wear all black. So I'm glad I did that. So we're going to talk about the show, how it gets made, learn about the people behind it. So Dina.
Yes.
We will get to this amazing podcast, but let's start from the beginning. As we just heard, you have lived a lot of places.
Right.
You're originally from the US.
Right.
And how do you end up in Israel?
Good question. So I grew up in, is this high enough? I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, never imagining I would live anywhere but America. And then I went to college in the early 90s, I guess I arrived on campus in 1989, and the first Intifada was raging. I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and as I said, the Middle East came to the Middle West, and I had these ideas. I'd go to spend my junior year somewhere romantic and exciting like Rome or Rio or Paris, and then I realized with all of the infighting on campus, I wanted to figure out this place called the Middle East. I was going to go to Jerusalem. And in a way, I am still trying to figure it out. And in a way, this podcast is part of that ongoing mission to figure it out. So tell us about The Branch, specifically how this podcast is different from all other bajillion podcasts that are out there, Sure.
but also how the stories it tells are different than the stories we normally hear about Israel.
Sure. So first of all, this is the only podcast of its kind that focuses specifically on relationships between Israelis and Palestinians or Arab and Jewish citizens inside Israel. There are podcasts that talk about Israeli politics, mostly about Israeli politics, and sort of talk shops and whatever drama happened that day. And the original idea, it wasn't my idea. It was actually Naomi Brun-Lerman's idea, her brainchild, to do a podcast about people who are working together. And then when Josh came into the picture, we kind of expanded and thought about, let's actually bring it into the field. Let's not just have people in a studio talking to each other. Let's actually see their lives and their interaction unfolding in front of us in sort of narrative style. And that's what's a kind of a combination show of interviews, but also in the field with them as they're doing, whether they're rapping at a concert or whether they're teachers in a school, like getting the feel of that place. And so often when we talk about what's happening in Israel or in the Palestinian areas, the people we talk to are the politicians or the people who are committing violence or the people who have been harmed by that violence. But very, very little do we actually get to talk to people who are actually interconnecting with a light that is not really usually shown upon them. And that's what this podcast does.
So the episode that really hooked me was, I think, 4 in, which takes place at one of the Hadassah hospitals in the dialysis unit. Can you tell us a little bit about, for those of us who have not yet binged the full series, which they can do on their way home, could you tell us a little bit about that episode and the characters we meet there?
Yeah, so that was the first episode we actually did that took place inside a Hadassah hospital. And I was being told, do something about this doctor or that doctor. But as anybody knows who's been inside a hospital, who runs the hospital, who knows what's going on, who helps heal you? It's the nurses, right? And I also wanted a place that we'd have intense interaction, not where patients were coming or going, but patients actually who knew the staff. And I had an uncle who had to go through dialysis, so I understood that people spend sometimes 3-4 days a week in a dialysis unit, 4 hours at a time. Otherwise, they will die, right? While they're waiting for liver transplants. And so I decided it'd be interesting to talk to nurses at this dialysis unit. And I came across 2 amazing people. The woman who runs the dialysis unit named Mali, and she's the daughter of Egyptian immigrants to Israel, Jewish. She speaks Arabic and speaks Arabic with her patients, and her sort of sidekick and right hand is a young woman named Amal, who's Muslim from a village near Nazareth. And the 2 of them have such a beautiful sort of work relationship, so like mother and daughter in a way, and they talk not just about their patients, but also about family problems and work and life and boyfriends and consulting, but also the place itself is a character, the unit itself. You walk into this unit, and I was amazed by watching Amal sort of acting like a traffic cop, like people wheeling in for, after the first morning session into the second session, lots of machines and whirring soundings and beeps. And in that unit, there was, for example, a Holocaust survivor from Romania. And across from him was somebody from East Jerusalem, whose cousin was burned to death in 2014 by Jewish extremists. And you have somebody else, who's bringing chocolates for all the families, and the families get to know each other, and the families look out for each other, and it's really an incredibly interwoven, impressive scene. And what's interesting about Mali also and Amal is how they learned from each other. They went to a conference together in Jordan, and it was the first time that Mali had ever been to an Arab country. And she sort of had Amal as her guide. And on the other hand, Amal talks about how Hadassah really is this oasis of tolerance and interconnection, and how when she leaves the confines of Hadassah, she takes the bus to her Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, and she speaks Arabic on the phone, and she gets hostile stares, and she gets dirty looks, and people say things to her, and she feels Hadassah is so different. She even comes to Hadassah on her days off, because that's where her friends are, and that's where she feels at home.
So let's talk about the most recent episode. I don't know if anyone's listened. We'll spoil it a little bit, but still worth a listen. It's called The Tour Guides.
Right.
And that is really great. So will you set the scene for us about what's happening in this latest episode?
This latest episode is my current favorite episode. I feel like every episode we do, Josh always makes fun of me because I'm always fall in love with whatever the characters we are focusing on this time. But this time it's two tour guides, Yuval Ben-Ami, who's a Jewish Israeli from Jerusalem, and Hussam Jabbar, who is from a West Bank village near Bethlehem. And they are unlikely friends, one could argue. Yuval is the son of the former spokesperson of the Israeli army. He had that role during the first Intifada. And while his father was the official spokesman for the army, Hussam was being shot at by soldiers and throwing stones at soldiers during the clashes as a young Palestinian. And he was actually shot and in a wheelchair for over a year, and then found his way eventually to conflict resolution, and looks at his tour guiding as part of that bigger picture of conflict resolution. They do really interesting tours. They do dual narrative tours. I'm sure many of you in this room have been to Israel, but probably not many of you have been to West Bank and been to a refugee camp and been inside Bethlehem and to the Church of Nativity. They take people to all of these places, and they hear the Palestinian perspective and the Israeli perspective, and of course there are many perspectives within those perspectives. And they are such close friends that through their work together and through their own personal journeys, that Hussam actually officiated Yuval's wedding recently, and describes being his kosher rabbi he's a Marxist, so he wore a red kippah to officiate.
Sounds very Jewish, actually.
Yeah, and I joined along with them. This was in early November. I joined along with them in Jerusalem, and I took the train that morning to Jerusalem at about 6:30 in the morning. And the taxi driver on the way to the train's like, "Oh, which way are you going?" And I said, "Jerusalem." It's like, "Okay, good, you're not going south because the trains are all closed to the south." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Did you not hear the news? There are rockets being fired into southern Israel right now." It's like, "Oh, great." And I started heading towards Jerusalem, thinking, okay, it's in southern Israel, it'll probably die down soon. And then my phone blew up with messages that Tel Aviv, the schools were being shut down. Meanwhile, my kids were home alone that day. My husband was abroad, and there I was in Jerusalem, and I was scrambling to figure out how to get them to friends' houses. And as I go into this tour bus with the tour guides, I'm literally getting a phone call from my daughter saying, the sirens just went off. I'm going into the bomb shelter with her 9-year-old brother. So there I am, sort of in a panic and a fluster. And of course, Yuval, who's on his way to take the tourists to what was supposed to be a day at Yad Vashem, and he was going to be explaining the story of his own family's tie to the Holocaust. He's the son of his grandfather was the only survivor from his family. He is instead now telling them the story of Tel Aviv under missile threat. So I ended up weaving my story into the story of the missiles and the tension of that day.
Yeah, I mean, that episode is different because while we hear your voice, right, you're guiding us through all of these episodes, we actually learn a bit about you. We hear your concern as this is happening, and it just contextualizes the tour. And so, Josh, this is an appropriate time to allow you to enter this conversation. As the producer, like listening to this episode, I'm sitting in my apartment in New York saying, wow, this is so much more real now that I know that you're affected by the rockets and we're seeing the tour about the different places, and it really sort of brings it home for me. Josh, you're also based in New York, and so I'm wondering if you could talk about what that experience, not the actual experience, but what your experience of this was.
Well, it's interesting because normally when I go to edit the show and put it together, I'm trying to remove as much of Dina as I can because we want to let the voices of whoever the subjects are sort of come through and tell the story. And, that's sort of, when you're doing something narrative, that's what you want to do. But then I got to the phone call that's in this episode. And again, my gut is to say, well, I want less Dina. What she needs to say, only to get it out of the subject and have it make sense. And then I had to flip as the editor and go, wait a minute, she's the story for this part. And it was a completely different way to sort of communicate without telling a story. You're just hearing it evolve. Her conversation with her friend who's now watching her kids and making them pancakes and so on and so forth, talking about what's going on and sort of understanding what it's like to deal with this directly. And also, you're still going to get 2 other different stories about how you're existing.
And so I imagine there are unique challenges in making a show across 2 countries. It's recorded in Israel, sort of like sent in the cloud to here, to New York, and then it's stitched together essentially. And what we know that comes through on our phones is sort of the product of your work here in New York. So first of all, time zone seems very difficult. And how do you just bridge that distance between the 2 of you, between the recording and the editing and the sort of, can you walk us through a full episode, maybe from like the germ of an idea to what we hear in the end, Josh?
So I usually, there's conversations that we have. She says, this is what I'm going to report on. I sort of ask a few questions to see where the story's going to go. One of the things I always harp on that she's probably sick of hearing is, where's the tension? Where are we going to make people care about the story specifically?
So you're saying there's not a lot of tension in that area?
No, we really have to exaggerate it to make sure you get in there. We got to pull it out. And then she goes and reports. She's got mobile gear, and so we might talk about, well, where are you going? What does it sound like? What does it look like? But it's very much Dina goes and sort of immerses herself in whatever the place is. I remember, what was it, the guest house one, which is on the beach, and it was like, I think I might have said, make sure you get me some water sounds, but she walked out on a jetty, and so we have them looking over a wall, and you can sort of, because that's the thing about what we do, is you also want to feel like you're there. And then eventually it gets turned into a script, which then I read through, and we have another producer who works with us in Israel, Skylar Inman, who had her own podcast, has done work with Unorthodox, does work with Israel Story, and she's great, and she sort of bridges between the 2 of us. But really it's, okay, now Dina goes and gets her audio and then writes the equivalent of a written piece, but knowing that these words are coming from tape that we're going to use. And then we read through it and go, is this boring? Is this interesting? What's too long? What doesn't make sense? What do we have to translate? And then eventually turn that into it. And I will say that, especially on this one, it's getting easier to do, I think. I feel like we have sort of mind melded a little bit more, and Scholar too, so that early on I might be like, no, you need to move this piece from the end to the beginning to build our story arc, and now, like, I don't think there was much change in this one other than, a little rewrite here and there.
So did you know to film yourself, to tape yourself with the rockets?
Yeah, I have to say, I was kind of channeling the New York Times, the Daily.
Yeah.
I was like, what would they do, I was like, I decided to call a couple of the friends that were taking care of my kids, and also another friend, and check in with them. And I was like, do you mind if I record you? And they said no. So I just took my tape, I just took the phone and, put the mic at it, and that was it.
So it could be, I'm Dina Kraft, and this is The Branch.
Exactly.
That was a daily joke for you guys. So basically, Dina, you're used to working with editors, right? But this is different. This is audio. You have had such an amazing career in print, and I'm so curious how what you're doing for this show differs, if it does, from the work you've done before, from the reporting to the creation of stories.
Right. I have to say that I feel like this podcast came as like a sort of manna from heaven in a way for me, because I have been doing print for so long, but I was always this print reporter who had a really big crush on audio, but didn't really know much about audio. So it was a great sort of learning curve to dive in. But once you start thinking in terms of sound, you become addicted to everything that you're very attuned to, like the slamming of a door or the ding dong of an elevator opening at Hadassah Hospital, or, I had one night where I was like pitch black in the desert at a Bedouin village doing an episode about two karate instructors, one who's Bedouin, and I was leaning over the goat shed trying to get the goat to bleed, and it was being very quiet, and I had the karate instructor's kid go in and not yank its tail, but go in and go, make some noise.
For journalism.
For journalism. It's all for journalism, of course. Yeah. Or, there's an episode that takes place in the Shuk in Jerusalem, and it's a restaurant, and the cook, Mahdi, comes in at 4:30. Well, he comes in at 2 in the morning, but Skylar and I slept over, came to Jerusalem the night before, slept near the Shuk, and then came at 4:30 in the morning because I had to get the sound of the onions frying, of him cooking up all the food it was right before Passover, and he was cooking up, vats and vats of matzah ball soup and kube soup and this and that, and but I couldn't phone it in. Like if I was a print reporter, I would just say, he cooks and he fries, but I needed the clanging of the pot, so I'd sit there, pots clank, and more onions, fry. I had I think Josh knows, about 15 minutes of fried onion sounds, and then the chopping sounds. But you just want more and more. And I ended up sticking around until about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. I was dead on my feet, but I needed to get the lunch customers. And I couldn't just say the lunch customers. I had to have the lunch customers ordering. I needed the sound of them ordering. I needed the sound of them grabbing a chair and yelling and asking for more coffee, So if anything now, what Josh always tells me, you keep the tape running, because as soon as you turn it off, something interesting happens. So I tend to have a lot of tape, and then that takes time to log and all of that. It's just a different workflow because it is much more labor intensive than writing a story. So then when I do go sit and write a print story, it feels easy after putting a script together.
You gave a great quote in a different interview, and I just want to read it to everyone.
Yeah.
I'll read it back to you.
Thank you.
You say, "I think of everything in terms of sound. When you bring someone whose world is very removed from you, when you hear their voice and what they've been through and what they live with, you can't dismiss them as caricatures." I was really moved by that because something we hear in a lot of these episodes is someone saying, when I finally met, they say a Jewish a lot, which I like,
right.
but when I finally met a Palestinian, when I finally met an Arab, there's a way in which that breaks it down. And so I'm curious, first of all, about how often that does come up and how much of a theme that is, and also how that affects you, because you're hearing them say all of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think they become real to each other. I think all of this is, and I think also it's for them, but it's also for the audience. It's all for all of you. Like when somebody's a nameless, faceless other, a Bedouin karate instructor, what does that have to do with your life? Or someone who comes from a refugee camp in the West Bank, or they're very distant from you, and you can think that their opinions don't matter, or that they don't, or their concerns aren't real. But when you hear what they're saying, and when you hear the way they pause, or where they even might stop to even choke up, or when they might laugh, or the sound of the laughter. I love the way Amal, the nurse at HMO, the way her laughter, you could hear it across the whole ward. You can't dismiss them. They're real to you. And when you read a print piece, it can be sort of flat, or if you see even a documentary or a video, there's so much information coming at you. But what is more pure than sound? I mean, somebody here told me they walk their dog and listen to the branch, or you're cutting up your onions in your kitchen and you're listening, and a million people, God willing, could be listening to the branch. But in that moment, only you were hearing that sound. Only you were having that conversation. And it is so intimate and so pure. And I think it's, in a world where we're so full of divisions, a voice just brings you so close.
There's also a lot of love, between the two nurses, between all of these sort of pairs of people that you follow. And we'll get to a few more examples. But Josh, it's so funny you're pushing for tension so much, and I know that's important, but just the respect, between the tour guides, there's this sense of there's hardship, right? And there's struggle, but there's really respect and admiration, and you really hear that. That's not a question. I guess that's congratulations. But how do you do it? How do you get that?
I think it's, you let them, you find the piece of where you're not creating the tension. They live a tension. And I think in the latest episode, when Yuval talks about when he first went into Jerusalem, when he was like, I'm going to go, I'm 18, I'm going to get stabbed to death, and that's okay because I need to go see the old city before that happens. And then he's like, but no. They all welcome me in, and sort of tells about meeting the Palestinians in there, or meeting the ultra-Orthodox that he didn't run with because he's secular, and going, and you could hear him living with it. It's more about reflecting the tension that we all know exists than even creating it. Is there a story arc where you want to manipulate something, like when the school was burned down and we want to tell that story tell that at the beginning before we give you resolution? Sure. But it's more about just reflecting the tension that we know exists and these people are overcoming intentionally.
Right. And sometimes the tension is so good, but we can't share the story. I mean, if we're doing a little behind the scenes, I can tell the story about Jonathan and Saud. So the story
This doesn't leave the room.
yeah, just not leave the room. But so Jonathan and Saud tell the story of, they are the only two people in the branch that I interviewed who I actually knew prior to doing the podcast. Jonathan Furziger was most recently of Bloomberg News, but he was my first boss when I was at Hebrew University. He hired me as his intern. And when I was an intern for him, in walked Saud Abu Ramadan, who at the time was his fixer. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term fixer, but we foreign correspondents could not do our work without fixers. Fixers are the local reporters on the ground who translate not only the language for us, but also the language of the culture for us and the politics. And they sometimes risk their lives to tell the stories. And Saud and Jonathan have both actually saved each other's lives in different ways, which I'll tell you about in a minute as well. But so, as many of you know, Saud is from Gaza. Jonathan lives in Tel Aviv, a Jewish journalist based in Tel Aviv. And it's very rare for a Gazan to be allowed into Israel since the withdrawal in 2005. You almost only see them in places like Hadassah hospitals for medical treatment. And then in very rare cases, a Palestinian from Gaza will get a permit. Saud is a journalist, and he got a permit through Bloomberg News, gets them occasionally. And so he was there for dinner at Jonathan's house. And I can promise you, we were the only only house in Tel Aviv that night hosting a dinner for someone from Gaza. And it was so rare that I brought my 9-year-old son with me because he has never met anyone from Gaza and may not likely in the future either meet anyone from Gaza. And joining us that evening in the living room was also Jonathan's son, who was in the Israeli army. And Jonathan and Saud, their relationship goes back almost 30 years to a different era, to the first Intifada and then the Oslo Accord. And Jonathan would bring his children to Gaza to visit Saud and his children. And Jonathan and Saud both got married at the same time, had children at the same time, their wives are friends. And so it's very unique to have this kind of bond between somebody from inside Israel and somebody inside Gaza. So fast forward to the 2014 war, Jonathan's son was a soldier, preparing to go inside Gaza, putting on his face paint, and thinking of who? Lara and Sarah. Lara and Sarah are Saud's twin daughters. They were friends. When they were little, they played together in the pool at the beach club in Gaza City. Hard to imagine today. And so we wanted to open that episode with that tension of, on the one hand, Jonathan's son putting on his war paint, getting ready to go into Gaza in the war, and inside Gaza, Lara and Sarah kind of joking to each other, what if Ishai comes to the door? What if he knocks on our door as a soldier? What would we do? But then it became when push came to shove, and I was, and the episode was about to go out, the family pulled back and said, wait, we don't want to make this public because we don't want our son, who was a former soldier, if he's traveling to Middle Eastern countries as he wants to do in the future, that he would be in any kind of danger because of this podcast being out there. So we had to quickly rejigger the whole thing and find a different tense scene to begin with, which it then became the scene of a different a war in Gaza. I think it was in 2009, and so many to choose from, yeah. In this case, the story of there was a phosphorus. The Israeli army had used phosphorus weapons in Gaza, and it wasn't clear how dangerous they were going to be to civilians on the ground. And Miriam and Jonathan were deeply worried, but found out that indeed they were going to be okay. But as soon as the war ended, they created a care package of food and clothing and medicine, and Jonathan delivered that to Saud inside Gaza, and we sort of started with that story and that very personal connection. And Miriam talks about, with all of the heartache and with all of the tension, she is so grateful that her children have friends from Gaza. Of course, now that relationship lives mostly in the reign of social media and meeting abroad, but that relationship exists. But these relationships will go extinct if the political situation does not change.
So obviously that was an episode where you knew people, but
Right.
You do the episode from last month, which I also love, the Code Breakers, which was about this initiative to integrate Arab Israelis into this famous Israeli high-tech startup nation scene.
Right.
And I guess I'm curious, how do you find these stories? How do you find these people?
Right. I mean,
and how do you get them to talk to you?
Most of the time they want to talk, but interestingly, the tech story, as Josh and Nomi know, I really wanted at first, I had this vision for the story to be about tech entrepreneurship, Palestinians in the West Bank, working with Israeli entrepreneurs and investors on the Israeli side of the border, but I could not find anybody who would talk to me. I kept getting shut down because there is collaboration, but the Palestinian business folks and tech folks don't want advertised out loud that they have Jewish Israeli investors and supporters and partners. So I had to shift gears and look for something inside Israel. And I heard about this really interesting initiative called SOFIN, which works to bring Arab computer engineers into the tech fold. More and more there are more and more Arab citizens studying in university and more of them studying computer science. But there's this disconnect. They were not getting jobs, in part because, not unlike America, where the jobs flow from friend to friend and social networks, they just weren't in those social networks. So part of it was sort of how to train them, not just train them, but how to connect people so they could get jobs in the first place.
And something that surprised me is that the Israeli army, is
Yes.
where you get your entree into the tech world.
Right, so that's a huge part of it. A lot of people get to know each other in the army, and when you go to Israeli companies, tech companies, they say, well, do you have experience? And when you're 24, how much experience can you have? But if you're in the Israeli army, you would have had 3.5, if you often have 2 to 3 years of pretty heavy duty tech experience. And that also shuts out Arab citizens from that world, so.
And so, in a story like that, there's such a power differential, right, between the Israelis and the Israeli Arabs in this case. But oftentimes, a lot of friendships and a lot of the relationships you talk to, one person, there's a power differential there too, right? The Jewish person you're talking to is typically in a bit of a different situation than their counterpart on the other side. And so I wonder, they're so open about that, and that seems to be part of the strength of their relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a disconnect in some of our cases. The people are on equal footing, but in some cases, for example, the story I mentioned of that's set in the Shuk of Madi and Michal. So Michal owns the restaurant, and Madi is her cook and sort of right hand, but she likes to joke that they sort of share the restaurant, but at the end of the day, she also makes it clear she's the boss. And she also, has economic advantage, over him, and also, she also, it was really interesting in their case, is they are not professional shared society people. Shared society being the new word for coexistence. In the old days, you would call it Israel coexistence, but there's been a pushback against that term because it's as if people live in their own bubbles. I exist here and you exist there. But the goal, and what you see also in Hadassah, is for a shared society, for everyone to live in equality and justice for all. And so in this story, it was really interesting because they were not used to speaking the lingo, and there was tension in their conversation about like who has ownership to Jerusalem, who has the right to this land, but also, Madi, during what was known as the stabbing intifada in about 2015, there were a lot of stabbings in Jerusalem. And although he came from Mount of Olives to the Shuk, which is on the other side of town, and he would take the taxis to get there. He was scared. He was scared of getting picked up either by Israeli police or soldiers or, kind of like racial profiling kind of thing. And he would take a taxi. And also his mother kept calling him on the phone, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Checking in with him. And Michal was like, "Why? What's wrong with, well, of course you're okay. You're Palestinian. Only Jews are under threat." Like it took her till seeing him, the fear that he was in, to understand that he also experiences danger and threat. And then there was also,
I was just going to...
Please.
With that story, what was really interesting for me, and I think this was one where, and Stephanie, this is where I get squishy about journalism, right? Is that there was this differential power dynamic in their relationship, which was really interesting, and watching her learn about what he deals with, like in that. At first, as I'm reading it, I'm listening to it, I'm like, wow, he's kind of her sort of Palestinian Sherpa, if you will, where that power imbalance was that big that they were both succeeding in something and she was getting the credit because she was the business owner. But when you listen and hear her sort of mind open to the experience that he's having that sort of mirrors her own and the tensions that are in there, you come to see how she almost came, even though she says, well, the Torah says it, this is for the Jews, and so on and so forth, and she espouses some right-wing politics, how she came to respect where he exists because she realized how they were sort of experiencing the same thing, and it diminishes that power dynamic, at least interpersonally. And I heard that a lot as editing that one. A couple of times I was like, do we tone down a little bit of her rhetoric? And Dina was like, no, and she was right. And we just sort of let it be, and that's what's most instructive about it, is let her tell her story as it is, and let him tell his, and we see that even though they're very different, they can still be in the same room with each other.
It's
around
not just,
knives.
It's not just any room, it's a kitchen. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of amazing part of this. This isn't like a negotiating table. These are people who see each other every day, spend in quite close quarters.
Right. You know, so often people say, he is my brother, she is my sister, and so did they. And they very much feel like family to each other. And Madi put every single shekel he had earned since, I think, the age of 12, when he started working in kitchens around Jerusalem, into building a house. And this house happened to be built, unfortunately for him, in kind of a no man's land in East Jerusalem between Palestinian Authority and Israel. And it was bulldozed, it was knocked down. And before it was bulldozed, she fought hard for him. She took him to a lawyer, found a lawyer from in Tel Aviv to sort of plead for his case. And in the end, it didn't help. But she got a lot of pushback. You know, she lives in Har Homa, which is East Jerusalem. It's considered actually a settlement. And she got pushback from her friends and family. Why are you helping your Palestinian employee? But she was like, it's Mahdi. And she also saw like the difficulties that he lives through. And so again, I mean, the tagline for this podcast is, these relationships, even though it's complex, it's always complex. And people don't always agree on everything. But one of the things that we've discovered in doing 16 episodes so far is the people who actually do get into things, the people who do get into the nitty-gritty of the politics and the identity and the conflicts and the hurt and the trauma and the different narratives, are the ones that actually come out of it with very strong personal relationships.
I mean, the perfect example of this is Sisterhood for Change, that episode with the two feminist activists and a Jewish woman, an Israeli Arab, and those conversations, they love each other, but those conversations they have are tough.
Right. They're tough, and they, but they, so this is the story of Samech Salemi and Hamutal Gori. And Hamutal Gori is Jewish and comes from this Israeli aristocratic family, one could argue. Her family came over on a ship that's like the Israeli Mayflower. Ben Gurion was on the ship, various future Knesset members and writers and thinkers. Her father is Chaim Guri, who is a national poet of Israel, who was a Palmach member, one of the elite pre-state militia, and writes a lot about the experiences of 1948 and his fallen comrades. And then comes into the picture Samech Salemi, and together when I met them, they had just been organizing these mass demonstrations against violence against women. And it was around the same time as the Women's March in America. And as you recall, last year there was a lot of tension around the Women's March. A lot of orthodoxies. If you're Zionist, you can't be in, you can't be out. And they were so incredulous. They're like, what's going on in America? Like, here we are, an Arab citizen and a Jewish citizen, and we are working for these common goals. And yes, it's complicated. And yes, Samech will get even pushback. Even her husband gave her pushback for working with the Jews. But she says, she said, it's so male to think we all have to agree on everything. That's so Martin Luther King. We are Martha Luther Kings, she told me. And we are all ships who sail in the same direction. And I thought that was such a beautiful quote and so instructive for American Jews or Americans in general, to think about the common big picture. And what's really interesting is that Salemi, Samech, whose family came from a village in the Galilee, and it was Palmach members that she says expelled her family from their village. She becomes very close with Hamutal's father, and to the point that she even translates his poetry from Hebrew into Arabic. And at one point, she's at a family dinner and she's with Hamutal's father, Chaim Guri, and Chaim Guri's hanging on her every word and hearing about her stories. And he says, tell me, where is the hope? And she turns to him and he says, the hope is in the friendship between Hamutal and myself. So I thought that was very powerful.
And she had a phrase, when she was describing his poetry, she was like, that poetry is about destroying my village. Like, it's real. Mm-hmm. And then for her to look at the Women's March and think, like, why can't anyone get along over there? Right. They don't have that drama. I need to know from you, maybe not your favorite episode, because it sounds like every single one that comes out is your favorite, but according to me, that also is the case. What is a story that you were like totally floored by, that you were not expecting, that went a different way?
I think maybe System Ali, the rappers. I mean, I knew that their music was powerful, and so they are a rap group based in Jaffa. Jaffa, of course, is the ancient port city of Jaffa, which is also part of the southern part of the city of Tel Aviv, largely an Arab population, but it's a dynamic that's shifting, lots of gentrification, lots of wealthier Jewish Israelis moving in. And this group was formed as sort of almost like a social protest movement against the gentrification. And it's Russian Israelis and it's Ethiopians, and they sing in Yiddish and Arabic and Hebrew. But what I was surprised by was their vision for a different kind of future, where just as in their music, where they mix and meld Arabic and Hebrew, and they bring in klezmer, and then they bring in traditional Palestinian music, they really sort of reimagining living together. And the words of Netta, who I thought, we called the episode "The Prophet and the Poet," because it's the story of Netta, who's the prophet, I would say, and then the poet is the his Arab counterpart Muhammad, who's one of the main writers, and they really talk so intensely about how much they fight, almost to this point of blows. And they'll talk about things like, of a conversation, for example, what's more difficult, to be a Russian immigrant to Israel or to live as a Palestinian Israeli and have your identity, challenged in various different ways. And they will almost literally fight about it, and then that fight becomes a song. And I thought it was so interesting and so instructive, and also another example of when you fight and you get to these really difficult places, you also have these breakthroughs, and the pain. They talk about the pain and the love and the connection they sort of forge, and they even have a song about building a new house and sort of reimagining things. And then last note about personal connections. I mean, this is a funny story. They talk about one day Muhammad is late to pick up his kid from daycare, and so he sends Netta in his place. And the Ganenet, the childcare director, calls Muhammad up, and she's like, "There's this Jew. He wants to take your kid. Is that okay?" And he's like, "Of course, it's Netta." But I think they are living an example for other people as well in their community. But again, it's not from playing it safe. It's from actually getting into the hard.
And that's something that you are doing on this show, and I think that we're all so grateful for. I'm curious, how has this experience changed you? And Josh, how have you seen Dina change over the course of working together?
I guess I'll start with change. I guess I keep thinking I'm going to run out of stories. I keep thinking I'm going to run out of people to talk to, and there are so many more people and so many more connections, unlikely and likely, that I find. So I think that surprised me, and I feel like a lot of people in Israel, on the left, on the middle, on the apathy. We're going to our third election right now. A lot of people just want to bury their head in the sand and not care anymore because it hurts too much to care. So I feel like when I see these people, whether it's teachers in a school working together, side by side in a classroom, and navigating really difficult points in curriculum together, or whether it's, the first episode, which I think is one of our favorite favorite episodes of musicians working together on stage. They just amaze me, like in their openness and in their friendship and in their joy, and they're doing it. As one of our listeners said, one day there will be peace signed, inshallah, God willing, Bezrat Hashem, right, between politicians. But the people who are laying the groundwork for that peace are the people who are featured in the branch. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Josh, let's talk about Dina.
Well, I think that, first of all, because she's lived there for a while, it was interesting for me to sort of pull out the power dynamic stuff that is easier to see from across the ocean. I've been there a bunch of times, but in hearing the stories, it stands out to me when it's like this person is the person in the position of power versus that. And to highlight that is not a thing that's good or bad, just that exists. And it's been interesting to see the insight into making that a pivotal part of every story that we've told, that we need to reflect that because it's the truth that's on the ground. I also think that she's gotten really good at finding that key point that we want to put at the top. I said it before, I think, but if you listen to the one, I think it's episode 2 is the Yad V'Yad one. The original version of that episode as produced was completely different, and I'm sure Naomi and Cheryl and a few other people that heard it can remember, Judy, that we flipped that episode upside down, because when we originally produced it, we left this story about some right-wingers trying to burn down this school where it's taught in both languages and everything else, and that was late in the story. And I said, wait. When I got to that part in the script, I said, we buried the lead. That's the lead. The point of that story was that this happened to the school, and then everybody from all around, all the communities, recovered from that. So everything needed to pivot on that fulcrum, and I haven't had to invert a story or say, I would rather tell it this way in probably 8 or 9 episodes. I might move a little bit here and there, but we've gotten to a place with the two of us and Skylar also that we sort of have gotten a unified vision on how to tell the truth in a way that will stick with you.
Right. Yeah, and I think, because this whole project came out of the mind of Hadassah, and that you have this, call them the islands of peace in Hadassah, and so it's interesting to see how this plays out in Hadassah, but how then you take out of Hadassah and see how you're seeing it in Nazareth, how you're seeing it in Jisr Azarka. I mean, this is very much a journey throughout Israel, and seeing how these islands are, connected in different ways, but how they are all over the country.
So before I turn this over to the wonderful questions that you all wrote, last question. You end every episode with the same sign-off. Will you tell us what that is and why you say it and what it means?
Yeah, we say, thank you, todah, shukran, which is thank you and for listening, basically, in all 3 languages. Right.
So, okay, this is a question about how you find the people and situations that you cover on the show. Do you have people reach out to you looking to share their stories?
Sometimes we do. I get phone calls from different organizations and places, but it has to be a relationship, right? At the moment, the current setup is that it's always a relationship between 2 people. So if it's just sort of that something is happening, that there's a dance performance between Palestinian kids and Israeli kids, that's not enough for me. I need to know, who's the glue, who's going to make the story shine and pop for us.
And sort of on the other end, have any of the Palestinians who have appeared in this show, have they ever been subject to attacks or sort of pushback or anything like that?
No, not that I know of. No. And actually, interesting, in one episode, was called Kids for Peace, about the only youth group in Israel that brings Israeli and Palestinians together, and it's in Jerusalem. One of the girls talked about how she was, warned by friends or told, oh, you shouldn't join this. There's a concept called anti-normalization, some of you might know, which is especially in the Palestinian intellectual community, this idea of do not engage with Israelis because we're not an equal playing field. And so there should be no contact, people-to-people contact. And so she pushed back on that herself and said, no, I come to this organization every week. I meet my friends, and I am a proud Palestinian, and I tell my story and my history, and I am equal with these friends. And the whole point is that I want to make these connections, and I want to make things normal between us.
So on that note, do you see the power differential getting any better, and do you think it is needed for better relationships?
Do I see it getting better? Thank
you.
Listen, there is a lot of hatred and a lot of tension in Israel, and in between Israelis and Palestinians, obviously. I don't know if I see it getting any better per se. It's hard to gauge, but I feel like the more these stories get out there, there's an example of other ways to be. Was there a second part there?
Is that needed? Is that to improve relationships?
100%. I mean, I think the more and more of that's the way you have true equality, right, and true partnership, and that's why I think part of what's encouraging is, seeing. I'd like to do a future episode about universities. I mean, some universities, like University of Haifa, is almost, if not 50%, close to 50% Arab citizens, And so you're seeing that connection in the classrooms, and you're seeing that, in the high-tech episode, for example, you're seeing more and more integration and more people working together, and that, I think, is really shifting things. And you're seeing how that plays out in Israeli politics, right? Like there's now more of a willingness than ever in Israel. I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. More and more Jewish Israelis are saying, yes, it's time to have Arab citizens in the government.
I would just add that it's important just to show that the power dynamics exist. I think it's something that, regardless of where we are or where we live, and this has been important for me in making these stories, is that the first step to fixing something like that is just going, yeah, look, it's there. It's like here or anywhere when we talk about privilege. It's not saying anybody's bad for having them. We're not criticizing somebody for having more power than somebody else. We're just saying, look, this thing is here, and we all have to navigate our way through the existence of this thing. And so it's the first step in going, okay, now how do we make it not matter so much?
Yeah, I mean, for me listening, the thing that I'm always struck by is how long it takes people to get places physically. Like if they're that, getting to the shuk is very complicated for some people. I mean, just the ways in which for people to get to their work, it's quite easy for some people on one side. And I think that even, obviously I knew that intellectually, and I've read that, but hearing it actually is so powerful.
Right.
Okay, what has been the feedback on the episodes? What do people say about the branch?
What do people say about the branch? I would say what I get most of all is lots of thank yous. Thank you for that this podcast exists. Thank you that this gives me hope. I had one listener in Boston who actually is Israeli and has been living in the States for a long time, she was, for example, the story about Hamutal and Samech, she was like, wow, it's so refreshing to hear these conversations happening in Israel where people who are so different can still connect and try to find like a common path forward. That she actually decided to move her family back to Israel for 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah, because she decided to put her kids in the hand-in-hand school because she was so inspired by the school.
Wow.
So that was nice feedback.
That is a big endorsement.
But people were saying but a lot of people saying, thank you for giving hope. Thank you for shedding a light on these stories that we don't normally get to hear. And it sounds sort of corny, but I think they're very sincere, that they are hungry for something else out of Israel to hear.
And do you ever hear from people on the episodes after they air?
The people who were
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Jonathan and Saud have gotten so much feedback. They've been told they should go on the road and have like their own road show.
I would say, just from a purely American perspective, I mean, well, I have friends that run the gamut, from like JVP members and people on the Canary Mission list, and other people who know people who run the Canary Mission list. And when I've had people hear episodes, they've unanimously come across and said, okay, I might not agree with this person or that person or this or the other, but it's important that we know that they exist. And I think that's the reason that I keep working on it, is because it's important that the stories exist to give pushback to the myriad side of all the stories. Like, I think this is, based on what I've heard there, this is sort of giving people the perspective on which you can have a Thanksgiving dinner without killing your uncle who is drunk and wearing a red hat or whatever, and that's been very much where the feedback that I've gotten has been.
So is there a theme where the people you meet find common ground, and what is the theme, and how do we sort of embrace it and unite? Fix everything, find the answer. What's the secret?
Well, I think there's always food involved, and we know that as Jews without anybody else. But I think,
by the way, even in the dialysis episode,
it's
there's
food.
people
We're
are
always
bringing
in
their
the
family's
kitchen.
food, and there's
And it's because everybody's got to eat, right? And so it's always remembering. And I remember the first time my wife's French, and the first time I met my father-in-law, who now lives in Nahariya, the worst part of Israel ever. So not for fun lovers, like it says on the entrance, but. The first time I met him in France, he said, so what do you think of France? Because I hadn't been there before. And I've said, everybody, everywhere, as much as they're different, there's certain things we all do, and we're all just trying to get along. And not get along as in be friendly, but get along in life. I got to get to tomorrow and the next week and the next month and next year. And I think that's the real theme that we've seen in the people as they are living, is they're all just trying to live their lives. And take care of their kids and take care of their families, and they wind up expanding their definition of who they care about, taking care about, just by interacting with people.
Yeah, you mentioned kids, and I feel like, I don't know how often we put a fine point on it, but at least in my conversations, they talk about their kids, and they talk about like the reason they became teachers or sent their kids to the hand-in-hand schools because it's for their kids. Or even most recently, the tour guide episode, Hussam's wife pushed back on him, like, why are you gonna have this, why are you gonna wear a kippah on your head, and you're gonna have this, be in this Jewish ceremony? And he was like, no, I want my kids to see this. Like, I think it's really instructive for them to know that we might have our differences and there are injustices in the world and all of that, but Yuval is my friend, and I want them to see that we can be not just friends, but like family, and I really want to live that example for them.
And you said that yourself tonight, which I really like, that you brought your kids to be part of these stories.
Right.
So there is hope. Here's a very practical question. How many hours a week do you work on this project? And B, how long does it take start to finish per episode?
Wow.
You go first.
That's a really good question. I mean, we do a story a month. So there's sort of it's a combination of things. It's finding the people, it's finding the story. It can sometimes take hours. And so, in fact, there's this two Achinoam Nini and Mira Awad, they're Israeli singers, and I've been trying for months to talk to them. And every few weeks, I send another email and trying to find, they're both divas and they both travel around the world. I mean, so sometimes I wish I had my own booking agent because it's so hard to find people. Even the two doctors we interviewed from Hadassah Medical Organization, it took weeks to get them to meet on the same day, and it was at 7 a.m. in the end because they both have such crazy schedules. So I feel like scheduling is one part of it. I don't know, I've never actually counted out as many hours it takes. It's, I don't know, 20 hours, 25 hours? I don't know.
I can say from my side.
Okay, tell me.
Usually I say when I'm editing audio, just in a regular conversation, that it's sort of like if you've got an hour, it's going to take 3 to 4 to 5. When I get the tape for an episode that's going to be somewhere between 25 and 35 minutes, to turn it from that to lining everything up, to moving things around, to adding music, to fixing stuff, it's 15 hours of sitting in front of a screen and sliding little bits around and listening back and going, does that sound right? Does that sentence land in the right place? Does this piece of music communicate the right things? And sometimes I'll send a link to Dina and Skylar and say, help me find the right music for this episode. Like with the tech one, I wanted to find, and I didn't wind up doing this, but I was like, I wanted to find something kind of computery. It didn't work out, but we found something better for it. And so it's very, and whenever you hear anything like that, whether it's Us or Israel Story or a produced piece on Unorthodox or This American Life or Radiolab or anything else you listen to, it's a massive multiplier, and the more sound and the more different things that are in there, the more complicated it gets. For example, with the rap one, which was a lot of fun to do, there's one point where she's narrating, this is really like sausage making, about being outside the club and then going in to see the band. Well, she had recordings from inside, but she didn't have recordings from outside. But I know how to make it sound like she's outside. But it took me a good 25 minutes to get the music to fade against one, so it sounded like she had walked in the club and she had been outside. And it's a really neat effect. And it was totally worth it because it puts you in the place like you've stepped into the club past the bouncer and you know what's going on. And it's worth doing, but it takes time because you want it to sound believable so that nobody knows it. So don't tell anybody.
And before we had Skylar as our field producer who does speak Hebrew, it was really fun for Josh when I would interview somebody who only spoke Hebrew. And then I would have to, first of all, I had to transcribe in Hebrew and then also translate into English. And then I had to give Josh translated English, transliterated English, where the beginning and the end of that section was. And it was meticulous and time consuming. And
there were a few times where I had to take the transliterate. I couldn't find the part, so I had to take the English, translate it into Hebrew using Google Translate, which gave it to me in Hebrew characters, which I could read, but I don't necessarily know what they mean. And then I had to copy the Hebrew characters into a transliterator so it would give me the pronunciation, and then maybe I could find it, and hopefully I got the right part.
So we're very grateful to Skylar. I mean, the funny thing is, listening to the episode, I would have no idea it takes that long because it does sound very seamless. Like, of course the music is supposed to be right there. It's supposed to be that exact music. So that is a credit to both of you. I like this question to end on. Mm-hmm. What makes this kind of Israel education important to frame Israel in a positive way? How does it help encourage people to support Israel?
I think it shows people what's really happening in Israel. I think it shows, that this is, even though it might be fringe in some cases, it is happening. And it shows that, that there are people working really hard to connect, which is part of the story of Israel. And people are trying to create a country and a society where that is not just where it is now, but to make it a better place. So I think that's a way to encourage people to care, I think there's just so much bleakness out there and so much also confusion, and of course with all the elections going on and all in Israel, news repeats itself. I remember when I was at the AP, we had sort of these jokes about, violence in Israel continues again. How do you tell that same story over and over and over again? And this, I think, brings color, and texture to what really is on the ground, and helps people really connect to what it looks like, it smells like, what it sounds like.
It usually sounds like chopping onions.
It sounds like chopping onions, yeah.
The one bit of pushback I would give on that question is that we're not framing Israel in a positive way. I wouldn't work on it if we were doing that. I know I've given Naomi, you should give her some ibuprofen because I've given her headaches over this. We're just telling the truth. And if the fact that these stories exist is the truth, it's not shining a false light on anything. It's just saying bad things happen in places. Things also are okay in the same place for other people, and they're a way to be okay, and good things can happen. But it's not a frame. It is just what happens.
Dina Kraft, Josh Kross, thank you so much, and thanks to you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.